Hi, everyone. So welcome to the first panel of the day. I'm very happy to be among this group of people who represent many different examples of successful divestment and investment efforts. And this is a chance to really probe, how did these successes happen? What can we learn? And so the way this is going to work is each person will speak for about 8 minutes. I'll ask some questions of the group, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A and try and give most of the time to that. I'll just quickly introduce who everybody is because there are more extended bios in the program. But as mentioned, it's a distinguished group. To my left is Julia, who helped lead a very successful campaign at the University of SOAS in London to divest. To my right is James Randerson, who leads the Keep It in the Ground effort at The Guardian, and who actually moderated a panel that I was on a couple of months ago, so having a little role reversal. Over to his right is Hendrik from the Church of Sweden, and to his right is Stephen Heintz from Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So please read their bios. These are impressive people, and you'll get to hear more in their stories. But with that, I want to, without further ado, hand it over to you, Stephen, to get us going.
Okay, May, thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. It is so encouraging and reaffirming to see so many people gather for a day like today and to hear the kinds of stories like Marianne's that we just heard and from Bill this morning. This is so fundamentally and profoundly important. And I could use my whole 8 minutes just thanking all of you and thanking 350 and the European Greens and everybody who is contributing to this solution, contributing to the future of the planet, human civilization, and the protection of the larger community of life. So thank you very, very much. Our story begins because we are a grant-making foundation with a mission that is to try to help build a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. So with a mission like that and a responsibility to manage our endowment in a way that will support that mission, it became increasingly uncomfortable to be in the position of using our grants budget to fight climate change while still being invested in the climate problem causers. It would be the same for us as if we were making grants for lung cancer research and being invested in tobacco. Now, it was a special problem for us, of course, and an ironic one, because the source of the wealth that we use to conduct our philanthropy was, of course, the founding of the fossil fuel industry by John D. Rockefeller himself. So this has been a process, and what I want to tell you today, very briefly, is how we got through the process and landed in a place that I'm very proud of, and why we think others can do the same and should do the same, at least should consider doing the same. So we began this process by having the larger conversation first about how could we align our investments broadly with the mission of the foundation, not just on the fossil fuel subject, although that's, for us, perhaps the most important part of our mission. I wanted to start with the broader conversation really at the philosophical level, because I thought that would be the way, the point of entry and the way to educate our trustees and our investment advisors and investment committee, et cetera. Because, you know, in the US, we have this odd law which says, on the one hand, foundations are required to spend 5% of their net assets each year in support of their philanthropic activities, but you can invest the 95% any way that you want. So we're really not getting the value for the 95%. We're only using 5% to try to contribute to our mission, and the other 95% is in the hands of investment professionals rather than in the hands of philanthropists and grant makers. So that's how we started the question. How can we use the other 95% in a way that still meets our financial goals, because we want to be around as an institution in perpetuity so that future generations can also pursue their philanthropic interests. But how can we use that 95% in a way that will also advance what we're doing with the 5%? So that was the point of entry, and this has taken several years. But the conversation began. We then got into proxy voting because we argued to the board and to our investment committee and investment advisors that our proxy votes are economic assets that we own, and we have both a responsibility to vote them, but we have an opportunity to vote them in ways that will help advance our mission. So we use proxy voting as the second educational lever to get the trustees and the investment committee to understand more deeply the environmental, social, and governance issues of being a responsible investor. Then in 2010, we said, you know, we're so deeply involved in fighting climate change in our grant making, let's start thinking about how we can use our investment assets to invest in solutions. And so we put before the board a motion, a resolution, which they adopted in March to commit up to 10% of the total of our portfolio for investments in climate solutions, clean energy, new technologies, other business strategies to help combat global warming. We found in those years, this was 2010, as I said, that this was very hard actually to begin to do. The deal flow, as we say in the investment community, just wasn't as strong. So it was slow going to find investments that we could make as an institutional investor, not as a venture investor, that we thought would meet market returns. But we kept plugging away at it. Finally, we decided it was time to start the divestment debate. And I want to thank Ellen Dorsey of the Wallace Global Fund, who has really been the driving force behind the U.S. divest investment campaign. And Ellen came to talk to us, and we began to work closely together. And we started a conversation with our board. And remember, half of our board of trustees, our governing body, half of them are members of the Rockefeller family. They are deeply committed to the work that we do on climate and energy, but they are also deeply committed to the legacy of their family and its wealth. So this was a very complex, important, sensitive conversation. But over time, we appealed to their good sense, to their logic, to their understanding of the science, and ultimately to their values. Because for us, as a foundation that is devoted to trying to help build a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world, this is fundamentally and profoundly a moral question first. This is the moral challenge of our times and for times long to come. And any of us who have the opportunity to stand up to do the thing that is right in these circumstances must, in fact, do it. And that appealed to the sense of moral and ethical conviction of the Rockefeller family in a way that I found deeply, deeply inspiring. And so by September of last year, we were ready to make our announcement, but we also knew that there was a second argument that helped us persuade our investment advisors and our investment committee that complements the moral imperative, and that's the economic argument. And I want to thank Mark Campanale, you're going to hear from him later this afternoon, and his colleagues at Carbon Tracker. Many people have referred to this already today. But their analysis is so persuasive that, in fact, as an institutional long-term investor, it is in your economic self-interest to divest from fossil fuels, because 60 to 80% of the known fossil fuels reserves owned by the oil companies and the coal companies simply have to stay put in the ground unburned if we have any chance of staying below the 2 degrees cap that we must, in fact, stay below. And so over time, those reserves are going to be stranded assets. They're going to lose value. And investments in the fossil fuel industry are going to be risky investments that are not going to pay returns. My time is up. My story is long, and I apologize. I've been granted a reprieve to make a concluding remark. Let me just say, I'll say the following, two quick concluding remarks. As Bill McKibben so generously said this morning, we made our announcement the day after the climate march, and the timing was very, very powerful for us, and I hope for others. But I was asked at the press conference, Mr. Heintz, you know, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is not that large. You have $860 million in assets. Isn't this largely symbolic? And I said, well, yes, it is symbolic. But symbols are important. Symbols inspire action. Symbols inspire people to do things. Symbols are what give us the poetry and the sense of what we can be. So don't discount the importance of symbols. They also do send market signals, very concrete market signals, and we've already seen that. 2 investment funds that we had turned down because they had fossil fuel exposure saw the announcement that we made and the global press coverage it was getting because of the supreme irony of the Rockefellers divesting from fossil fuels, came back to us in the weeks after and said, you know, we're really interested in this. We're now thinking about organizing fossil fuel-free investment funds, and would you consider being a lead investor? And in fact, we have done that. So symbols can change behavior. And that's what we're seeing. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I know I'm really testing your patience at this point, but this is not easy. And I want to say this for those of you who are institutional investors. You can't just throw a switch overnight and divest. It's complicated for all kinds of reasons. Commingled funds, lockup periods, you know, diversified portfolios. But it is possible if you go at it with intention and are honest about the challenges and how long it's going to take. We are divesting, but it's going to take us 3 years to get down to 0 to do it responsibly. Thank you very much for your patience.
Yes, thank you. Somehow I feel that the very linkage is when you say about symbols, because I am from World Council of Churches in Church of Sweden, and many of our faith communities, we are also important in that case when it comes to doing symbolic action. And today is a very timely day to talk about this, because in the ecumenical world, the 1st of September is a creation day. And the Orthodox patriarch, Bartholomew, who is branded himself as the Green Patriarch, this is the day when he delivers the creation message. And also this year, the Pope added 1st of September as a praying day for the creation. So he joined the ecumenical movement, and we have for lots of years in the ecumenical movement have started creation time with 1st of September until the 4th of October, which is the Franciscus Day. So this has been, on symbolic way, we have dealt with this for a long time. So I think this is a very interesting day for me to be in this panel. Also that the first of every month is what we started with a climate fast for climate, that has been interreligious also accepted, that people from all over the world are fasting on the first day on every month until the Paris meeting, the COP in Paris. Actually started in Warsaw when at the COP, when the chief negotiator for Philippines, Jeb Sano, voluntarily started his fasting. And he said, this is a spiritual thing of fasting. So this is also symbolic in some way to do this. And I tried this out with some friends. I'm not fasting today because you have given me such a nice meal. And it would be impolite not to eat. But to try this is also to make some remark, yes, this is for real. We are not just talking about And also we have another symbolic way that we have a pilgrimage in all over the world until Paris. The Norwegians started in Svalbard in June and have gone all through the countries. They have gone we'll meet them in Sweden. We'll deliver this baton or this water relay to Denmark and then all through Germany, and there will be people who have pilgrimage all over Europe just to come to Paris to manifestate the importance to have a good decision and a good outcome of the Paris meeting. So this might seem meaningless action, especially when we're talking about divestment, but I think this kind of action pushes us to act. It's not comfortable, like you just say. It's not comfortable for us to pray for one thing and act the other way. It's not comfortable to act by fasting and then take decision that goes in the opposite direction. And this is one question on why it is important for faith-based organizations to divest. I represent both Church of Sweden and the World Council of Churches, and both organizations have been very active on climate change for a long time. Actually, the WCC has been to all of the COPs since it started in the 90s. So the line is so clear that we can't stay with investments in funds that's supporting fossil fuels when we at the same time advocate for a low carbon development. And we know that emission of greenhouse gases will affect poor people of the world first. And those witnesses are something that we are getting more and more of from our sisters and brothers in churches in poor countries. The divestment movement in the church where I come from, Church of Sweden, started in 2008 when we had the Archbishop invited to the Uppsala Interfaith Climate Summit. It was an interreligious meeting where we produced a manifesto that from all world religions and other faith traditions come together under this manifesto. And it was pointed both to faith communities to act and to political institutions to take brave decisions. And this was before, as we say, Brokenhagen instead of Copenhagen, the meeting. We really wanted something to happen and did not. But to do something like this, to act like that, also have a repercussion on the organization itself to say, hey, we might get questioned. Where are your funds? And of course, this started the divestment in 2008 from coal and from oil, but there was still some natural gas. And as you mentioned, it's not easy. It's not an overnight decision. It takes some time. But there is a connection between talking about something and acting, and you should not say it's just talk, because talk sometimes also realize in other ways. And we are totally fossil-free from 1 year ago. It happened just before you announced this in the March in New York. And that is pretty much the same with the World Council of Churches story also. The highlight is that the investment for Church of Sweden shows also a better return than the average Swedish stock market. And we are pleased that for a third consecutive year, the returns for the total portfolio have outperformed the reference portfolio. You see, I've just written down what the same would say. The returns during 2014 with 3.5%. So the risk is to stay, as you said. So it also shows, for those who just look at the figures, it also shows it's a good deal. But even more important is the reinvestments. You cannot really change just by not investing in fossils. You must work for your investments that support sustainable development. So that is the hard work that we are doing now to look for this. But it's getting further. The World Council of Churches Central Committee passed a resolution not to invest in fossil fuels. The decision followed by the Finance Policy Committee report, which said the committee discussed the ethical investment criteria and considered that the list of sectors in which the WCC does not invest should be extended to include fossil fuels. So this is step by step a way of doing what you say you want to see for the future. I think that the role for the divestment movement that you all are a part of here is another voice in a large choir that tells us that we must move forward. I think that the ethical movements for investments have a long story in the family of churches. We cannot speak against war industry and at the same time letting our money work in the same industry. We cannot act against climate change and call on political leaders and enterprises to stop climate change and at the same time invest in fossil fuels that is causing a huge part of the climate change. That would have been a high level of hypocrisy, I would say. I think that I'm close to my 8 minutes, or? Yes? I think I will just end it with say that I think, as many mentioned today, that climate change is the main challenge of our time. We need to make a real change to avoid a future that will be hard for the coming generations to deal with. We need innovations, we need political decisions. Everybody agree with that, but we also need visions and long-term aspirations. And I think, from my opinion, that faith could play a central part when it comes to bringing the people of the earth together in a common vision that will last and helps to bring the transformation of the earth that we desperately need to create. And justice and equity is a part of the spiritual vision that faith communities can bring. Faith communities can also bring hope. And hope is something else than prognosis. The origin of hope is in the transcendency. A people of faith are a people of hope, and hope is a first step to walk the path of transformation. I may even use the word of St. Augustine, one of the old church fathers. He said, hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. And we need that kind of hope. Is not just to be dumb. I think that faith can be a carrier of hope and its beautiful daughters, anger of the inequalities and the greed that destroys the earth and the possibility for future generations, courage to start the transformation needed for a more just and equitable world. Thank you.
My name is James Randerson from The Guardian. May mentioned that we had been on a panel together. That was at the Glastonbury Music Festival back in June. And I can say that you're a much less muddy audience. You also look less hungover, which is good. But I can say that that is proof that divestment is officially rock and roll now. So I'd like you to cast your mind back to Christmas Eve 2014. You were probably wrapping presents, hanging out with family, maybe with a glass of Christmas cheer. I was kind of doing all of those things, but I stupidly sort of dipped into my emails, and there was an email there from the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, from a couple of hours earlier. It's pretty unusual for him to email, let alone on Christmas Eve, so I felt I'd better read it. And a few days earlier, the news had leaked that he was going to be moving on from The Guardian after 20 years, and he had about 5 or 6 months left in the job. And in this email, he said that he wanted to, he'd been mulling over what to do with those last few months in the job and felt it was sort of an incredible privilege to have this period of time to kind of devote to something, and he decided that climate change was the thing that he wanted to do in that time, and he felt a sense of regret that although The Guardian has put a huge amount of effort behind reporting the environment, I think we've got more environment correspondents and editors than any other mainstream news organization in the world. He just felt that the media had not really managed to get to grips with climate change because it's such a big problem. All the reasons that I'm sure you know, it doesn't feel immediate to people and all of that kind of stuff. And so he was issuing a challenge to me and a few other people in the organization to come up with something eye-catching that we could do over the next few months to really put this front and center and to kind of set the stage before Paris. After Christmas, a lot of discussions ensued involving lots of people from all parts of The Guardian, not just the environment desk. That was very important to the business desk, politics, people who do interactives, all bits of The Guardian. And one of the ideas was to have a campaign of some kind, which we ended up doing, although there was, not everyone agreed that was the best way to go. Some people said, The Guardian's strengths really are in bringing new information to the table, in reporting, investigating, uncovering new facts, and that's what we should focus on. But nonetheless, Alan felt, and many of us felt, that to really give this effort, this big push, a kind of cutting edge, and to make it stand out, a campaign would be, a very effective way of doing that. And there were lots of discussions over what we should campaign for. Some people said we should come out in favour of nuclear power. Some people said, we should try and influence the text at Paris. And there's all through these discussions, we slightly disconcertingly had microphones in the room, and you can hear a lot of these discussions on the podcast that we put together that kind of charts the course of this campaign. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we went for divestment, and specifically to use that as a tool to highlight the carbon budget idea that has already been and spoken about and everyone knows in this room, I'm sure. But we particularly focused on two, rather than sort of saying, everyone should divest, it's a terribly good idea. We focused on two organizations in particular, the two largest medical charities in the world, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, which is a bit less well known, but based in the UK. They have very large assets as well. They've got £18 billion in investments, many of which, and they also invest in companies like BP and Shell and so on. And so we sort of went from there. We launched in mid-March with this sort of call to action, and within a week we had 100,000 people signed up to the petition. That number's well over 200,000 now. And we, as well as the campaigning side of things, we were sort of doing things like showing the link between some of the good work that these organizations do, and they do an immense amount of very good work. But we went to Africa and we showed places where they were working and the incredible work they're doing on the ground in South Africa to alleviate health problems there, while at the same time being invested in a coal plant nearby that is causing a whole load of those problems. We just thought, this is crazy. These are two sensible organizations that work on climate change, understand the danger of climate change. Why would they want to be contributing to the very problems they're trying to solve? But we also went much broader than the campaign. We also did a series of investigations into some of the fossil fuel companies, the political connections of BP, particularly in the UK, and the influence they have over government, the way that Peabody Energy, the coal company, was using the Ebola crisis in Africa for its own aims, and so on. And we also sent reporters to 5 locations around the world to look at carbon bombs. These are massive fossil fuel projects that, if they go ahead, are going to be pretty catastrophic in terms of taking us over 2 degrees. One of them was the Galilee Basin that Bill mentioned earlier on. In Australia, we sent someone up to the Arctic, and so on. Now, the campaign, generated a lot of interest and controversy in equal measure, I guess. I mean, The Guardian, it's not the first time The Guardian's campaigned. I mean, we actually have done a climate change campaign in the past in 2009 that was more about kind of consumer actions. And recently we campaigned against female genital mutilation. But this one, particularly in the US, was, you know, raised a few eyebrows. But that was good because it gave us a platform to get out there and you know, give the message, if you like, to be there and talk about the fact that, you know, isn't it strange that a news organization is pinning its colors to the mast? I think it's particularly unusual for the sort of US journalistic tradition. So I'm probably near my 8 minutes or maybe over it already, but no? I've got 30 seconds, gosh. Well, please do seek out the petition and sign it. We're still running. Any influence you can bring to bear on Bill Gates, please call him up, suggest to him it might be a good idea to divest. Actually, next week, a separate local campaign is starting up in Seattle. So I feel like the efforts of the campaign are sort of spreading out there. I mean, I should say, very importantly, that this wasn't just our effort. We, from an early point in this, teamed up with 350, who really are the experts on all of this and had made so much of the running in the years up to this. And so, you know, their help and advice and general support and being part of it has just been absolutely invaluable. We couldn't have done it without them. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, May. Thank you so much to the host for having me. It's really, the lineup of this event is great, including a lot of my heroes, so it's really a pleasure to be here. So my name's Julia, and I founded and, along with several other amazing students, led the Fossil-Free SOAS campaign, which resulted in April of this year of SOAS. SOAS is part of the University of London, resulting in SOAS committing to divest from all fossil fuels, so oil, gas, and coal, within the next 3 years. So this, speaking of sort of being on the same event as several of my heroes, in fact, it's kind of come full circle in a way, because the campaign started when I attended the Fossil-Free Europe event, which was in November 2013. And Bill McKibben spoke, as well as Kumi Naidu, the director of Greenpeace International, and they showed the great film Do the Math. And there was something about the event and the speakers that really grabbed me, really for the first time, in terms of having enough sort of motivation to actually go out and start something, which I'd never done before. I think it was a combination of the fact that it both seemed potentially effective and it also seemed achievable. It was an action that I could take at an institution that was close to me, that I was part of, my university, where the decision makers were accessible to me. And I also thought that the logic, the sort of theory of change behind the campaign really made sense to me. It was something quite direct, it was concrete, it followed the logic of the successful apartheid divestment campaigns. And I thought that they're really, like the apartheid divestment campaign, this campaign had the chance to really make clear that fossil fuels are a thing of the past. They're not something that we want to invest in the future, and that acknowledgement would come from sectors of society and of the economy that previously haven't really come out and said things about climate change. And I think one thing that the campaign has been really good at doing, and I've been very interested to see this unfolding, is kind of expose the inconsistency between what we sort of say we know we need to do in terms of reducing emissions, and then this sort of parallel reality we seem to be living in, where we're continuing to invest in and rely on the expectation that actually we're not going to reduce emissions. So I think it forces us to ask the question, actually, what are we doing and what actions do we need to take? Because they need to be dramatic changes, actually, and we need to make them quickly, and that requires urgency, it requires commitment from many different actors, not just environmental NGOs. So I think that's really been something, that's kind of why I got involved in the campaign in the first place. So at SOAS, the campaign sort of started as student campaigns always do, with sort of building student support. SOAS is a famously very political university, so it wasn't difficult to have unanimous student support for the campaign, which we did via several student union motions. But actually, the campaign really took off at a particular moment, which is when management actually got behind it, and they ended up pushing for it quite a lot internally. And this moment was actually when they asked, they commissioned their investment advisors to look into the financial impacts that divestment would have on SOAS's portfolio. And actually what they found, so they basically ran a historical analysis of the performance of a fossil-free portfolio over the past, I think it was 1, 3, and 5-year periods, versus the performance of SOAS's current portfolio, which does include fossil fuel stocks. And they actually found that SOAS would have done slightly better if SOAS had not had oil, gas, and coal stocks. So I think that was really the game changer, and that's when it became a bit of a no-brainer for SOAS to divest, because the moral, ethical arguments were all very clear, particularly for an institution like SOAS. SOAS stands for School of Oriental and African Studies, so we specialize in studying the cultures of Africa and Asia. So, we say we care about Africa and Asia, but those are the regions that are the most impacted by climate change, and yet we continue to invest in these. It was clear from SOAS's perspective, ethically and reputationally, particularly as other universities began to divest, that SOAS did not want to be sort of a lagger in this, and that rather it was important to take the lead. And when the financial case became so clear, there was really no reason why not, and it all moved quite quickly after that. Resulting in, on April 24th of this year, SOAS's governing body unanimously decided to divest from all fossil fuels within the next 3 years. So this is a great moment. It was, for those of us involved in the campaign, it reminded me of the agenda video as well. That level of achievement and emotion was really great. And particularly what was really gratifying, and I would say this is the highlight of the campaign for me, was that it really felt like a joint effort by everyone at the university. So the students, we all came together. Many of us had never worked together before. We made a lot of new friends. That was incredibly satisfying and empowering. But also management played a key role. And in particular, the director of SOAS, Paul Webley, who's recently retired, he really was instrumental in kind of going behind the scenes internally and advising us who we needed to convince on the inside in order to make it happen. And he even, when the campaign concluded, on his own initiative, wrote a letter to the Times, or wrote an article in the Times, calling on other universities to divest. So I think he really saw it as a personal achievement of his, and that was something that meant a lot to me as well. So, yeah, I mean, May asked me to mention a lowlight, but I would say, apart from the occasional bureaucratic delays that are inevitable in this kind of thing, I wouldn't say there was one. I think it was a really positive, constructive campaign that I felt very proud to be a part of, and inspired me to do further things in the future. So I'm not sure how much time I have left, but okay. Well, I think I'll just finish with just 2 messages for people in the audience. The first of which is to those of you maybe who are sitting there and thinking, that sounds fun. I might like to start a campaign myself. I really couldn't recommend it more. I certainly think it was one of the best decisions that I made, even just in a personal sense. It was really fun. I met loads of people. It was really inspiring, really rewarding. So I certainly would recommend anybody sitting there thinking that they might like to have a try to do it. And then to the institutional investors, I would say, what are you waiting for, really? I mean, I think the financial case, every portfolio is different, but if the financial case that SOAS showed that it was better for SOAS to divest than not to divest, the ethical and moral case has been laid out by many other people better than me, but I think in light of that, it seems to be such a strong imperative and a financially sound decision to divest, so I would urge you to do all you can to make that happen. That's all from me.
Thank you, everyone. And as you probably all gathered, we're missing a panelist. Marianne, unfortunately, had a flight issue, so she's not with us. But just wanted to make a note of that. Thank you all very much. Since now everyone knows I'm being very strict about the time, I'm self-conscious myself about asking my questions. But I have a few follow-up questions for each person, and then to you. Does the sound okay? Yes? Okay. So I'll just go right in the same order as the speakers. And my question for you, Stephen, is you talked a lot about how this was in many ways an existential question for the foundation. And can you talk a little bit about proceeding from your decision to divest? How has this affected other things at the foundation? How has this affected your thinking about even grant making and beyond?
Well, I think it's done 2 things for us. One, it's fascinating to see people who, in our stakeholders, who were the most skeptical, but ultimately came around to the consensus, now feel so proud to be associated with an institution that has done this. So that's wonderful. And they are very eager to help us accelerate the pace of investing in the solution side, which we are doing. We now, as I said, we set an initial target of 10%. We're going to exceed the 10%. We're going to keep building on this, and it's beginning to really grow. Second, we now are asking ourselves the question that Hendrik referred to earlier. If we look even more broadly, one of the pieces of our mission is peace building. We're very active in Israel and Palestine. What about divesting from companies that profit from the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories? And so you end up having to try to be consistent. This is a huge challenge, but it's important, and I think that's very healthy for us.
Question for you, Hendrik. One of the things that, as divestment was starting, particularly on university campuses, a lot of interest in whether faith communities, how many would divest. And you spoke about how this actually started from an ecumenical perspective. And can you talk about how has this led to more collaboration from an interfaith perspective on divestment? And what's the ecumenical nature of divestment, and how do you see that moving forward?
Yeah, if we talk about ecumenical, it's among Christian churches.
Beyond.
And beyond, if we start with Christian churches, I think that when different churches start a divestment, it's easier to hook up on the others. But I think those who have been most involved in advocacy on climate change, working with their partners in South, it's not a long shot to start a divestment process. So I heard last it was one of the churches in Canada, I think it was the United Church, have decided for divestment some week ago, and in Australia, New Zealand, other churches around the world are doing this. When it comes to the interreligious dialogue, I think we still need some more steps to do this, to come to this concrete. And also that, I mean, if we, from a Western perspective, we think of churches as huge organizations, but all religions are not organized like churches are. Some are landowners, some have nothing. So it's a different kind of discussion. But I still think this is very important to, especially churches who have been advocating for this, to put the money where your mouth is in that case. Yeah.
Thanks. And James, you're in this position of reporting on divestment everywhere, and so I'm interested to know, what trends do you see? What are some of the lessons that you're picking up as you're kind of following the story of divestment globally, and keep it in the ground as well? But where does it seem to be going?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that we decided that divestment would be a good thing to have the campaign about was that it already had this incredible momentum, which is due in no small part to 350, and that there were so many, a great variety of organisations already doing this. But it feels as if since Christmas, that momentum has just increased, that it's becoming more mainstream. Back then, it was mainly over in the US. What stage were we at? I think that in Glasgow, they were approaching the point of an investment decision, but that was the first British university to make the decision, and they hadn't done it at that point. Now we've got Edinburgh and what's the other one? Hertfordshire and SOAS, of course, and Oxford, sort of. The momentum is definitely continuing. I would say there's a certain one sort of slightly negative point is that some institutions are trying to pretend they're divesting without really divesting, and coming up with so many caveats around the divestment commitment that it doesn't mean a great deal. And if that's a first step and it means they're then going to move on from some coal companies to all coal companies and then on to oil companies and so on, then okay, that, you know, maybe that's fine. But if it's basically a way of keeping the campaigners at arm's length, I think that's unfortunate, because it's disingenuous, and it's, you know, so they're trying to, you know, bask in the glory of the divestment movement without really making the hard choice that needs to be made. One thing I forgot to mention actually in my opening remarks is that we have the same sort of hypocrisy question in the back of our minds, because the Guardian has an endowment of, well, it's not really an endowment, but anyway, we have a fund of £800 million roughly to maintain the Guardian's journalism in perpetuity, and that was invested in a very conventional manner. And so part of the campaign, in a way, was to persuade the commercial board of the Guardian, who were entirely separate from editorial, and, you know, even Alan Rusbridger, the then editor-in-chief, couldn't tell them what to do. We you know, sort of challenged them to do that. We sort of started the campaign with that question hanging in the air, which some might say was incredibly foolish, but actually within about 6 weeks they had looked at the evidence, taken the decision, and said they had done it on hard-nosed business grounds. That was the phrase they used. So I think they must have done a similar analysis to the one that you mentioned.
And last question from up here for you, Julia. I think one of the things that we notice in movements on any issue is the role that young people and students play in pushing everyone forward, and that was certainly true of divestment. So the question for you is really, if you could push us all as we're sitting here concentrating on divestment investment, where do we need to be pushed? Where does it need to move?
Well, I think climate change is an issue that it's easy to feel kind of powerless about. That's something that I've felt for my whole life, and I have always been concerned about it. I think because it's such a big issue, because it affects everything that we care about, everything we invest in, everything we hold dear, I think it's easy to kind of just throw your hands up and say, you know, it's not my job, someone else will do it, we'll do it later. But I mean, I think we all know actually it really has to be now, and it really does have to be us. And I think what young people have been very impressive in this regard, actually, and I feel able to say that without being arrogant, because I'm not sure I really would even call myself young. I'm 28 and can't even get a young person's rail card anymore. So I think there's some of the students that I worked with on the SOAS campaign, you know, they were 19 or 20, really, really young, and like showing, I think, incredible, much more than when I was an undergraduate. I was a master's student at the time, incredible amounts of maturity and responsibility in kind of taking on this issue and saying, actually, this is my future, and I'm going to do something about it. And so I suppose I would hope that others of older generations would be inspired by that and try to emulate it and say, you know, in the capacity that I have, and for those of you who are in a position of responsibility at an institutional investor, you've actually got a great privilege in the sense that you do have the power to do something about this, which many people don't have as much as you. And so I hope that you would sort of take that responsibility and do everything within your power to use the power of the institutional investors to push for action on climate change. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. So now we can open it up for questions from the group, and feel free to direct them to an individual, or if you have a more general question. So I'm just going to go. I'll start here, and then you'll be next.
Thank you. My question is for James Randerson. I've been very admirative of what the Guardian has done, particularly in March, and with the wrap-up cover targeting all the biggest polluters in the world, as this was really impressive. In France, things are much more dire. For instance, the three main news magazines in France, which are Le Point, L'Express, L'Obs, none of them have issued a cover tackling climate change in more than 5 years. None of them. And so I'm very concerned about the way the press is dealing with this matter. Obviously, to me, the Guardian is one of the mainstream news organizations that has gone the furthest that I know of. And I was wondering, how do you think other news organizations could be brought in the same direction as you went?
Well, thank you very much for your kind words, and we try our best. it's always difficult. People often ask that question: how can we encourage other news organisations to, to take this more seriously? And I think it's difficult for another news organisation to do that, other than to sort of try and lead by what we think is an example, if you like, just to do what we think is the right thing to do. Because the media is incredibly, it's sort of schizophrenic. On one hand, the media is incredibly cannibalistic and is stealing stories off each other all the time, but at the same time, there's a tendency to sort of do down the competition and their stories or their attitude to issues of the day. So we sort of found this with the Edward Snowden NSA story that The Guardian broke. Basically all the other newspapers in the UK took the opposite stance and called us traitors and said that merely putting this information out there would be dangerous to security and so on. Maybe that many people in this room agree with that, but it was interesting that all the other newspapers had taken that stance possibly because they hadn't broken the story in the first place. And it's a little bit like that with climate change. And some people have said to us, the very act of running a campaign made it very difficult for any other, even elements within other newspapers who might want to get behind divestment in a less overt way. It made them difficult to do that because it was seen as a Guardian thing at that point. So, perhaps, if that's the case, perhaps that's unfortunate. I mean, it's interesting that you say there's a problem in France, because normally people talk about the British press and the American press in particular being, very reactionary when it comes to climate change. And, other than the Independent, the mainstream newspapers are, mildly skeptic at best in the UK. But generally things tend to be a bit better. I mean, I would say that Le Monde is part of a whole network of publishers called the Climate Publishers Network, which we helped to set up a couple of months ago and is effectively part of the whole initiative. And that includes newspapers from all over the world and, from Australia to Africa and everything in between. So it's not all bad here, but it's interesting what you say.
Hi, Jan Louvel from Bank. Oh, sorry, it's for the person. Jan Louvel from Banktrack. Thank you very much for your rich testimonies. I have a question on a related topic, which is banks. The Galilei campaign was mentioned twice today, and the success on this campaign in Australia up to now has been amazing, particularly on the bank side, which with the international movement that managed to have 3 big international banks, Société Générale, Commonwealth, and Standard Chartered, to withdraw from the project, and 10 other international banks to commit not to finance this project, which is absolutely unprecedented. And this is very important because that's one of the tipping points of our global fight. And to build on that momentum, we have launched this summer the Paris Pledge campaign, and we ask international banks, private banks, to commit before the COP to end the financing of coal, and it's now supported by more than 100 organizations around the world, and I encourage all of you to support the campaign also. Which leads me to my question. I was wondering, since your organizations have started at least to divest, I was wondering if you have already thought about this as another step to complement the divestment, to switch bank and to change your bank, the bank account of your organization, if it's one of the big international banks financing fossil fuels. Thank you for your answers on that.
Thank you very much. We have not yet thought about our banking relationship in that particular way. I would say that one of our goals in participating in the divestment movement was to try to make divestment and, the understanding of the carbon bubble a mainstream economic phenomenon. And I am impressed with how more and more mainstream this discussion is becoming. And we do have relationships through our investment committee with 2 of the most successful and large and important investment banks, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. And in both cases, they now, in the time that we've been working on divestment with them, and others have too, I'm not claiming this is something that was a direct result of our own work, they now have both established business units that in fact are being responsive to clients who are interested in both the divestment aspect, but also the proactive environmental, social, and governance investing practice. So I think you're right. I think ways of taking this mainstream in the financial community into the financial institutions is another important next step.
I think there's definitely an appetite out there amongst people who want to take practical divestment steps in their own lives, and that's something we've seen in the supporters who've signed up for the Keep It in the Ground campaign, because we've been in sort of constant contact with them via email, asking them, you know, what do you want to see from the campaign, what information do you want, all the rest of it. And one of the things that came back very strongly was people saying, what about my own investments? What about my pension? What about my bank account, et cetera, et cetera? And so one strand of what we've been doing is giving people practical information along those lines. You know, how do you put pressure on your pension fund to move in that direction? Which banks are most heavily exposed to fossil fuels, and so on. So yeah, I think you're right. This is, even if each of those moves on their own are quite small, what they do is sort of build pressure and, as you say, build awareness in the financial community about it.
Oras Tynkkynen, currently with the Finnish Innovation Fund, previously a member of Parliament. It's very inspiring to listen to climate leaders like you, so thank you so very much for your great work. I have an impression that most of the successful divestment cases have come from English-speaking countries or Scandinavia. I can think of one case from the Netherlands. I wonder if you share this impression, and if so, what do you think we could do about that to spread the divestment movement more globally? Thank you.
Well, I think one important reason why the divestment successes so far have been concentrated in Anglo-Saxon countries in particular, I think, is because we actually have quite unprogressive university funding models, and increasingly so in the UK. And we have investment funds, which state university systems don't have. So that's enabled divestment to be used as a tool in universities, particularly in the US, where Harvard has a huge endowment. In the UK, they're much smaller, but they do have endowment funds as of about 15 years or so. So I think that is one important reason, and I think the solution is to look at other types of funds that exist. I think pension funds are something apparently that only exists even recently in Germany, which I didn't know. But there will be different funds, different types of funds in different countries that could be a target for a divestment. So I think the answer is to think creatively and look beyond universities. Yeah.
One other thought that just came to my mind is that in the Anglo-Saxon community, of course, the relationship between the state and the market is considerably different than in the social democratic community, in which Scandinavia and lots of non-English speaking countries are more organized. And so there is a sense that it's the state's, maybe the state's responsibility to be the lead force. In countries like my own, where obviously the market, is everything. It's the market that has to be the focus.
And if I think Marianne were here, she would point out that perhaps the most successful divestment effort yet took place in Norway. So, the Norwegians.
Maybe we need to learn how to speak more languages.
There's that too.
Hi, I've got two questions. The first one's for James Randerson. What communications have you had with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around the divestment campaign? I think the Wellcome Trust has responded. Has the Bill and Gates Melinda Foundation? And then for Stephen, you talked about how the fossil fuel divestment drive has made you look at other areas around divestment, for example, occupied lands in Palestine. Could you expand on that a bit further, please?
So, yeah, as you say, the Wellcome Trust have responded. Their sort of chief executive wrote a piece explaining that they agree with us all the way up to the point of divestment, really, that you know, they agree with the carbon budget, and they just feel that their main argument is that they say they can have more influence with the companies by staying invested in them rather than taking their investment out, to which the obvious response is, well, what have you been doing with this brilliant influence over the companies? And they say, well, we can't, I'm sorry, terribly sorry, we can't tell you that, because if we were to do that, then we would break all sorts of, confidentiality and so on, and we would lose that influence because we wouldn't be seen as reliable partners or something like that. So it's a pretty dissatisfying response. Who knows? Maybe behind the scenes they're having incredible success, but it really doesn't look like it from the outside. The Bill and Melinda Gates, that was your question though, really. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have had sort of behind the scenes conversations, direct with the top, but those, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates have not chosen to sort of respond publicly. They have there's a very strange setup that the organisation has, which is that the foundation itself technically doesn't have any money; it just spends the money. And so, whenever you ask the foundation press office, what do you think about divestment, they say we can't comment. That's the job of the asset trust. And if you go to the asset trust, just never talks about anything. So you're in this kind of slightly Kafkaesque situation where it's difficult to get a straight answer. So yeah, the only response that we have had that we're sort of able to print is direct from Bill Gates' office, which is along the lines of, we respect the passion of the campaigners, and Bill Gates is doing lots and lots on climate change. We think that you may have seen in the news about 4 weeks ago or something like that, he put a large investment into renewable energy technology, I think $2 billion, and we think we probably guilted him into that, but unfortunately he didn't say so.
So thank you for the question with regard to Israel and Palestine. So as a grant maker, we are supporting Israeli and Palestinian groups and American and European groups that are working for peace in the Middle East. And we have spent a lot of time in Israel. We've spent a lot of time in Palestine, in the occupied territories, in Gaza, to really try to understand the depth of the crisis and the conflict. And the question then arises, there are economic factors that perpetuate the conflict, and we know this. This is true not only in Israel and Palestine, it's true in conflict zones around the world, that there are those who profit from the conflict itself. So we are just in the early phases of examining what that means for us as institutional investors. We are not interested, and I want to be very clear about this because it's very controversial, we are not interested in isolating the state of Israel. I'm personally a very big supporter of the state of Israel in general. I am not a big supporter of its current policy with regard to Palestine. We are not interested in isolating Israel. We are not interested in punishing the broader economy of Israel. What we are looking at is the narrow economy that profits from the occupation itself. And that gets very difficult to do technically, as well as, of course, the political and moral questions that it asks. So we are at a very early stage in this process, kind of in the way that we were on the climate divestment question 2 years ago, I would say, and we're going to work this through.
I can't see very well, so let's do it from the back and then to the front and to the back. My apologies.
Thank you. My name is Alain Todd. I'm the former president of REFED, which is the French Student Network for Sustainability. I'm also part of the COR11 planning team. COR11 will be the conference of youth that will be held in different cities just before the COP21. My question is about divestment movements in Europe. I would like to know which is the state of the advances of divestment movement in European universities.
Wow, I can say about universities, maybe other people can answer better for other types of institutions, but in Europe, as far as I know, like I said, the UK is the only country where university divestment would really be a good strategy, because as far as I know, it's the only country where universities have private endowment funds. As far as that, 5 universities have divested so far. In terms of, I think maybe it would be better if one of the Scandinavians, or the Scandinavian, answered about there's been quite a few victories in Scandinavia recently as well.
Yeah, I'm not really the expert, but I know that there are in Scandinavia also the divestment movement is going, and I think we have the history, because during the apartheid time the discussion was where to place the money and how to isolate South Africa. So there is a tradition to see where the money works, and apartheid and climate change is often put up on the same discussion, because it's very much like each other. So I think, I know that the pensions funds are looking at this in Sweden, for example. I know that the pensions fund for retired priests, like I'm soon to be old man, they also divested everything. So that is also a fund that sort of takes this agenda up, and I think that is more and more sort of mainstreamed also from Scandinavian countries to different funds must sort of be, they must at least be ready to answer the question, and that is something that happened during the last years, I would say.
And I would offer that I think there's a lot of people in this room who could probably help, so maybe just a quick show of hands if you're happy to talk to this guy later, more information. And you can also go to gofossilfree.org/commitments, which is where the Go Fossil Free campaign tracks commitments, and anyone is welcome to do that. You especially can do that. Next question, down here in the front, please.
Yes, hello. I just, in response to the previous question, my name is Alexander Russell. I work for an extra financial rating agency called IRIS. More generally about sustainable investment, there are a lot of very good, short, easy to read reports now on the global trends published by the likes of EuroSIF, the European Sustainable Investment Forum, and also the GSIA, the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance. So yeah, I really encourage anyone here to have a look at those reports. There's a very clear tendency every year, the percentage of people not just avoiding fossil fuels, but generally making sustainable investments is rising very quickly. I had a question for Reverend Hendrik Grape. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. If you look beyond climate change, I think there are many similar tendencies in modern society. Many of us feel that society has a tendency to go too fast. Every change has to be progress. It's not anymore about preserving the world that we already have, or, you know, if you're religious, protecting God's work. We have to change it the whole time. And I'm worried that even if we divest from fossil fuels, and even if we invest in renewable energy, etc., we're still running. We're racing towards a cliff, and instead of slamming on the brakes, we're just swerving. So where do we go next? I feel like faith, you were saying faith can contribute hope and symbols and various things. So I was wondering if faith could maybe more generally contribute a message to help people to stop running and kind of to calm down. All faiths across the world have messages like fasting. Fasting is a tradition across the world that helps you to take a step back, to take stock of your life and to focus on priorities. And it's also healthy, doctors are starting to find. And also, yeah, more generally, you know, you have the idea of meditation, of humility. But until recently, religion has often been negative. It's always phrased in terms of greed or in terms of, you know, don't be selfish, don't be mean, don't be violent. Do you think that faiths around the world can start playing a positive role in helping us to invent a new lifestyle where we're maybe more frugal, more humble, and ultimately more happy?
Wow, that's a good question. Yes, of course, I think that some see religions as the huge problem of our world. To see all the conflicts that stems from religious beliefs. We have this Islamophobic Europe that I also live in Sweden. We see that different conference is fueled by religious. And that is one picture. The other picture is that all of the world religions and faith traditions do have a sense of something that to save the creation, to be friendly to your neighbor, to act in solidarity with others. It's all in every traditions. So from my perspective, I think it's important for those who are working in that tradition to come together and say, we are not in opposite of each other. We have one earth. We know that we have one earth. We know that our way of living is not sustainable in this world. And so divestment is one part of a transformation to a society that could be more sustainable, that could be more peaceful, and that could be a more just world. And I think, and my hope is, and my work is, that religious faith traditions could be a part of this transformation that we need. I often refer to Bangladeshian, Samuel Hook is his name, who's been involved in the climate business for a long time. And 10 years ago, he said that we are the first, when they talk about climate, it was just the environmentalist who was involved. And then we talk about climate, and then there was all the relief agenda, and people from the politics were more involved. And they say, we have the technique, we have the political instruments, but what we need are the value-based movements to help us along to come over to something that is called sustainability, to transform. And in that case, I think that faith communities, wherever they are from, are important to fuel this transformation, because we have such a short space of time. So we need it when we get the values right, it's easier to change. Sometimes Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when he uses the same language as with our party, say, hey, leave the industrial society behind. Come over to the winning side. That's the new society, that's transformed society. That's a much better world. Not to go there by threat, but to go there with a vision to make a better world. And if faith communities could play that part, we have done it when it comes to peace issues. Why not on this sustainable issue? But that's a hope. It demands hard work, and we have some obstacles also to come by. So thank you.
Thank you, Hendrik. That was actually the perfect note to end on, I think, for two reasons. One, we are out of time, and second, it's always good to end with the big picture. So many thanks to our wonderful panelists and for your questions. I believe we have a coffee break, but Reinhard knows the answer.
Yes, indeed. There's going to be a coffee break now, and we would ask you to be back by 3:35, and we will start the continuation of the program with Desmond Tutu, who's just been mentioned by Reverend Grape, we have a video from Desmond Tutu where he makes the connection between the divestment movement again to fight apartheid and the new divestment movement against fossil fuel. And after that, we have the conversation with Monsieur Rousseau and our panel on creating a sustainable financial system with all the experts of investing into the alternatives. So please enjoy the coffee break. Be back by 3:35.